Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
I've had many jobs: labourer, tyre production, political organiser, aid worker, member of parliament, writer, broadcaster, but the one job I would have loved and can never have is Kremlin advisor. Our first guest is that, or rather was, and more. And he's here to talk about the Ukraine as the gears crash upwards towards what could end up as a full-scale European war if last week's agreement doesn't stand. He's Alexander Nekrassov, and he joins us now. Alexander, the ceasefire comes into effect tomorrow. The Minsk agreement this week has some similarities to previous agreements, some differences. Tell the viewers, please, how you see the agreement and whether you think it's going to stick.
Well, it is different from the one we had in September last year. And I think the difference is that I think that all sides seem to be more serious about the end result. I think there is a certain will has appeared after these long discussions this week. And I think that what we are witnessing here is that both Kiev and the anti-government forces, they are prepared to give this a chance. Now, having said that, and I always welcome, by the way, when politicians meet and talk, even if they don't sometimes understand each other, don't want to understand each other. I think that the most important thing lacking in this document, in this agreement, is that the promise by the West not to drag Ukraine into NATO. I think the main reason for this crisis developing and spreading is because there is a perception in Russia and in Eastern Ukraine as well that America and the European Union want Ukraine to become a full-blown NATO member. Now, Poroshenko and his lot in Kiev have been making all sorts of noises, basically saying it's time for Ukraine to join NATO. That's a bad thing. That creates problems. That creates problems in all respects. And that actually makes Russia think that there's a game behind everything that Poroshenko says and does. There's also a perception in Moscow, in the Kremlin itself, that Poroshenko is a war president, that he is there to actually conduct war, that basically his future depends on that war. If that stops, his position becomes weak and he might fall. So that is where this perception has to change. Poroshenko has to prove to Russia that he is not a war president, that he is the president, as he says himself, of all Ukraine. Now we need to see that proved by actions, not just, words said today this and tomorrow this.
Well, he's not much of a war president because his army has pretty comprehensively lost the war against coal miners, factory workers, ordinary civilians who couldn't put up with the situation anymore. How do you account for the, well, feeble performance of his forces? Is it a lack of morale or what?
Well, I think there's a lot of problems that they have there. First of all, of course, their cause is not just a just cause. I think a lot of people, a lot of soldiers and officers in the Ukrainian army do not want to kill their own people. Any army is very reluctant to go against its own people. Now, also we have those so-called battalions funded by those oligarchs who want the war to go on because they are making money out of that war. These battalions obviously are hardened killers, but they're not really professional fighters, are they? And I don't think that they can put up a serious fight. And when they encounter the sort of resistance which they encounter in the East, I think they've never really thought that, those former yesterday's miners, cab drivers and so on would fight like so courageously and die for their people and for their country. I think the biggest mistake the West and the new regime in Kiev made was to alienate the East. This was a huge mistake. This was such a huge miscalculation that they're paying for it even now. And I think that the people in the West are gradually starting to realize.
Well, I wonder, and that's, I think, an unanswered question from Minsk. Does this represent any kind of fissure between the European Union, particularly Germany and France, and the United States. Exactly. Isn't it the case that the United States is quite happy with the war, wants to confront Russia, but the German and French leadership do not?
Well, I think personally that the reason why Merkel and Hollande suddenly rushed to Moscow and all over the place is because there is a realization in Western Europe, in Brussels as well, that this war can get out of control, that this war can spread to Europe. I think this is the only reason why suddenly we had this surge of diplomatic activity. I think also Merkel and other leaders realized that Obama might not be bluffing with his idea of arming the Ukrainian army with heavy weaponry. Now, first of all, you have to be very naive to think that NATO is not already supplying the Ukrainian army. We have seen on Russian television examples of the weapons, heavy machine guns, ammo, even light armored vehicles and tanks and so on, coming from the West. Okay, there might be third parties, but they're still there. The Ukrainian army would not have been able to fight for so long without supplies. So it's a bit of a hypocritical maneuver here on the part of Obama and his administration to pretend that they're not supplying. They are supplying already. They're probably now talking about heavy weaponry. Now, I would think that, I'm guessing here, but Obama's advisors are telling him, and Obama is not a strong president. When it comes to foreign policy, he's a novice. And Obama's advisors, who are probably influenced by all sorts of people in Wall Street and so on, are saying to him, we have to keep the pressure on Russia. And which means, of course, continuing with the war.
And the sanctions.
And the sanctions. And that's why the Europeans don't want that, because they are suffering. Because whatever Mr. Cameron is saying, or Merkel, or Hollande, or others, they are suffering. They are losing money. And Greece, I think, there's an interesting part on the Greece's government is saying, look, this is hurting Europe. They are open now. They're openly talking about it. And I think that Europeans now understand that. Americans don't want them to understand. They don't care about Europe. And this is, I think, this wedge, Putin is now driving it wider. I think that's quite clever of him. And that is why I hope that pressure in Europe on their politicians would lead to this agreement, at least, you know, all the sides trying to make it work, unlike the previous one. The previous one didn't work from day one. No. You know, they started firing practically the next day. This time, there's a certain change of mood. I feel it, at least.
One of the tendencies of Western media outfits is to start the clock ticking on a story when their cameras arrive and when it suits their narrative to start the story. Newsnight told the truth this week about the provocation, the massacre of people in the Maidan, which in a way was the beginning of this story. They showed in a remarkable film that the official story, that it was the then Ukrainian government who conducted this massacre, is completely untrue. And they provided the evidence which proved, as was suspected by some of us at the time, though we were ridiculed as conspiracy theorists, that this was a deliberate provocation to internationalize this story and to provide the momentum behind the coup d'etat which then occurred. Is this widely known in Russia? Does everyone in Russia disbelieve the West's narrative? Or is there, as it were, an opposition ramp inside Russia that blames President Putin for the current impasse?
Well, the majority of Russians obviously believe that the opposition during those days of protests was responsible for what happened in Kyiv, for the bloodshed, because Russian media was there, on the ground. It's very difficult to say to people, oh, look, you know, it was Yanukovych's people starting all these horrible killings, when there is footage of it. They showed it. I mean, Russia Today, their journalists were there on the ground. I think they've got many awards for that because it was actually a brilliant,
very dangerous.
It was a brilliant
assignment. Yeah.
you know, reporting on their part. So for the Russians, it's no big deal, to be honest. It's maybe, you know, Newsnight here saying this is remarkable, although I would say it's just ticking the box, you know, balanced coverage, where you have 90% or even more of the coverage very sort of biased and very anti-Russian. And then occasionally they do invite even me, for example, you know, sometimes on their shows, and I say things that I say to you now. So I think they tick that box, balanced coverage, because it's so blatantly anti-Russian that I think that now they realize
so no one's
that
exploiting it in Russia. Is President Putin's position still very strong in the country?
I think President Putin's position will be strong for quite some time, because the biggest mistake the West has made is to try to interfere in Ukraine and on the border with Russia. You know, after the Russians saw those footages of the dead children, dead women, you know, on the streets and so on, of Donetsk and Lugansk and others, there's nothing you can do now to change their minds. It's very difficult. I think we had a fascination in Russia in the Yeltsin years with the West, unfortunately, I would say.
So we could steal Russia's things.
Well, yes, so that the trillions would flow into the Western banks. But I think now this fascination, even amongst the liberals, you know, Russian liberals, they're very opposed to everything Putin says and does. I think it's changing now. It's going. The young were very, you know, excited about, oh, Western values, Western cinema, Western culture, Western music. It's changing now, because suddenly they realized, oh no, the West has its agendas. And Ukraine was a big mistake, huge mistake. I think they've misjudged it. I sometimes wonder, what sort of advisors do they have, you know, in London, Paris, Berlin, Washington? What do they say to their bosses? Don't they realize that this is a dangerous game they're playing? Don't they realize that it will hit them back? Not the advisors, of course, but the countries.
Well, as I always put it, don't think our countries are run by James Bonds. They're more Austin Powers. Alexander, wonderful. Thanks very much.
Thank you
for coming on board the Sputnik. Coming up after the break, a legend in my lifetime. He's a revolutionary, a rock star, a writer, and a right big fan of RT. He's Robert Wyatt, and he's up next on the Sputnik. Welcome back to Sputnik. From the 1960s until now, Robert Wyatt is a vindication of John Lennon's observation that a working-class hero is something to be. With Soft Machine as a solo artist and as a collaborator with the likes of Elvis Costello, he helped transform the British music scene. But just as importantly, he's clung all his life to the need for a still greater transformation, that of society as a whole.
He has remained a rare thing, I'm sure, amongst the top flight of rock stars. A Marxist who had his shoulder to the wheel in many great British struggles, not the least of them, the miners' strike 30 years ago.
He's young, gifted, and he's back with just last month an authorised biography of Robert Wyatt by Marcus O'Dare. The book has stormed the fetid corridors of the BBC as Radio 4's Book of the Week, and Robert Wyatt joins us now on board the Sputnik. Let's talk about the book first of all. I know, Robert, you didn't write it, you have no stake in it, but it really is doing well. It's getting critical acclaim of the kind, perhaps for the last few years, you haven't had. Tell us about it.
Okay, a young man called Marcus O'Dare. I'm extraordinarily young, but then I'm maybe extraordinarily old. I came up and said, can I write a book about you? And I thought, well, yeah, you know, it's a free country, go ahead. So I didn't know what he was going to do. This was about 5 years ago. But anyway, he went away and he did an amazing amount of homework, interviewed us a few times. I think I was so pleased that he really made a real effort to understand the songs and the music I've been doing, a real effort, and cross-referencing, you know, what I was singing about. I'm very grateful to him.
Well, we'll talk about your music career in a minute, but what makes you particularly interesting to me is the fact that you are someone who's been steadfast in your political ideals. I myself have never lost the faith that I have had all since a teenage years Were there any moments when you were tempted to lose your socialist faith?
No.
You've been...
I mean, the thing is, I came to it late. I noticed, I think you jumped into it feet first. I mean, from your background, it was, you know, that's the way to go. I came from a rather vague sort of background, mostly brought up as a sort of, I don't know, Christian, liberal, Labour voting music person, art person. And it wasn't really till the mid-70s, and particularly when I met my wife Alfie, who's very well read politically, but then in the mid-70s anyway, that I started to get concerned. And it's like you don't miss stuff till it's gone. And I did notice that that the gains made by the Labour Party that my parents had voted for when I was born in '45 at the end of the war, they were born with a lot of hope, you know, about, you know, a land fit for heroes, free health, free national health, all this stuff, and that it was sort of being dismembered and sneered at as kind of anachronistic. And I started to panic, thought, whoa, wait a minute. So the paradox is I'm a sort of, in that sense, I'm a socialist conservative. I don't like this right-wing revolution. I'm a reactionary. I really like...
When everything sacred is profaned and all that solid melts into air.
I just didn't like it, and it wasn't great analysis. I just thought, I don't like these people who are taking over. You know, it was not just the Tories, but I didn't really like, after, you know, that bloke who came in after Harold Wilson, I just didn't like any of it. And then I felt I was pushed to what they call, you know, the hard left. Because I thought that what's called the centre ground was kind of vacuous, spineless, chinless, and insult to the idea of pluralism, really. I thought there must be another way of looking at this. And to my surprise, I found myself drawn to Morning Star newspaper and those sort of people, and drawn into the various
and it's still
events.
Going. As we are.
Going.
Let's go back to the beginning of the musical scene. Who knew that in a town like Canterbury, such a music factory was developing, a bit like Detroit and other scenes that have developed? Well, not if you've seen Detroit recently. It's a very depressed place. Tell us about the Canterbury scene. What was in the water in Canterbury at the time that you and others were coming forward?
Yeah, okay. Well, a lot of us at the school where I was were jazz fans, because I spent the 1950s at school, basically, from the age of about 5 to about 15, 16. I left earlier than most of my friends. I wasn't very academic. But while I was there, we listened to jazz. It's what we listened to. And I suppose the seeds of both the ideas and the politics come from that, because it turned out that most of the jazz I liked was by what are now called African-American musicians. And they became our heroes. And so as the years went on and I saw more what was going on in the world, I couldn't reconcile the status of African people and people of African origin politically in the world with the fact that they were, if anything, the aristocracy of culture as far as I was concerned. So it was trying to square that circle that got me drawn more and more into politics. It came to a head when working in the early 70s with a few South African exiles, Chris McGregor, but a trumpet player, a trumpet player called Mongezi Feza, who I worked with, was the same age as me, and died in hospital in England when I was about 30. I say he was the same age as me, in a way that was quite unnecessary. And I was so cross about that I just got stuck into the anti-apartheid struggle, and then that could have led to that connotation to associated with all the others, you know, Palestine and so on.
We have failed at many things in this country. We once were great as an industrial power and now are not. But culturally, we have maintained a tremendous output. To what do you account for that?
Well, I think that one of the things that happened after the Second World War, this is retrospective understanding. I mean, I was just too busy doing it at the time. But there was a thing that happened, which there again took for granted at the time, but we didn't realise was rather short-lived, which was simply that the Labour idea was that working class people should be allowed the same access to education and opportunity, at least, as everybody else, which of course meant necessarily free education. And lots of working class kids went into art colleges, and you'll find that a lot of rock bands, people, including John Lennon, of course, and Pete Townsend, were art college people. And it's funny that it wasn't the music colleges, which was still quite elitist at the time, but the art colleges. And the thing about the art colleges is it's where kids who weren't very academic could express themselves. And it turned out that they would do painting, but a lot of them wanted to be in beat groups. And at that time, people like the Beatles and so on, they were all picking up on rhythm and blues in America as an alternative to the more saccharine pop stuff. And that seemed the way to go. And we started out, they don't now so much, playing for dancers. So it's very good playing for dancers because it's not about me, self-expression. It's like more like being a cook in a restaurant. You're trying to serve the people. And if you don't get the beat right, they won't dance, you know. And so if you do get it right and they do dance, you're doing your job, you know. And I love the feeling of that, and I recommend it to any musician starting out. Don't go around I want to express the great me. Do some work playing for people in pubs and clubs, you know, it's good for you.
Speaking of pubs, I understand that you've become a verb now, Wyatting, when you randomly put different tracks together in the pub.
I can see how that happened. It makes my missus very cross, though, because I'm very polite like that. I'm not, it sounds paradoxical, I'm not actually a troublemaker. If I lived in a trouble-free world, I wouldn't make it, you know. But I wouldn't want to upset a pub full of people if they're playing pop records. So I would never Wyatt myself.
I just want to go back to how jazz inspired you at the time and how that entwined with politics and political movements, basically. How do you see today's jazz music and its link to political motivations?
And if I may add, we had Gilad Atzmon,
he certainly did. I saw that
a few weeks ago.
Who was very
on
much
here.
entwined with it.
Comes from the most unlikely places. You in Canterbury, him in Tel Aviv, even more unlikely.
Look, Gilad, I've been lucky enough to have Gilad on most of the records I've done this century, three or four CDs, and 3 or 4 of the ones I'm most happy with. And he's great to work with in the studio. You can't stop him, you know. Get in there and he said, what do you want on here? A bit of clarinet. He said, do you want a bit of saxophone? Do you want a bit of tenor? Yeah, OK. He just works out. He loves to play.
He's an amazing musician,
He's got an energy, blimey. And it's all content. It's not just, you know. So Gilad,
so how do people get, I mean, you in Canterbury, him in Tel Aviv, how do you come to jazz?
Well, in his case, he heard, I think, some Charlie Parker records when he was a boy and just thought, these are my people, and it's very funny. And he sort of translated that into his own circumstance. But in my case, it was simply that, in fact, around 1960, about 10 years before a lot of white stuff came up really early, there was some very militant black, as it was then called, American music, jazz. People like Max Roach, who did an incredible record called We Insist, Freedom Now. Sonny Rollins, a saxophone player, who's still playing. Did the Freedom Suite. Charles Mingus was playing Fables of Forbes against American people who were stopping integration and so on. And so I was actually politicised by those musicians. And another thing that happened alongside that was that black Americans, a lot of them, the musicians, started giving themselves, became Muslims. And of course, everyone knows about Muhammad Ali from Cassius Clay. He said, I'm not Greek, so I'll call myself Muhammad Ali. But then there's all kind of people. A saxophonist, some of my favourites, is a bloke called Yusef Lateef. Even the great drummer Art Blakey changed his name to Abdul Al-Buhaina. They were all doing it. Shahid Sihab. These are all names of African-American jazz musicians at that time.
Robert Wyatt, you certainly ain't stalling at 70, still going strong. Thanks for coming on board the Sputnik.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Well, about the Ukraine, Reza Amra says that the foundation for World War III is being laid. And so it got me thinking, is the Ukraine a Kosovo or a Syria waiting to happen? Evelyn Brunswick says that Syria is also all about Russia. If Syria falls, Russia loses last Western base, surrounded and isolated Cold War?
Well, I don't think Russia's particularly isolated right now. It has a next-door friend. I forget
Like
what it's
Bob
called.
Dylan.
China it's called.
Okay, right. Well, that's all that we got for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us on Twitter at @RT_Sputnik and on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.